Neuroendocrine system, the mechanisms of action and regulation. Why is it important to understand? Your body is in a constant struggle to maintain homeostasis within the cells and tissues of the body based on internal and external stresses placed on it through everyday activities. And in order to meet this demand, two distinct and yet highly coordinated systems of tissues work in unison to ensure that first, all tissues know what is happening to all other tissues of the body, and second, that all tissues are able to change their functions so as to meet the change needed to maintain overall homeostasis. How is the system able to do this? It utilizes chemical messengers to pass signals. Either these signals come from neurological origin, neurotransmitters, or cytological origins, cytokines. It is the cytological messengers that are typically classified as hormones that we will be focusing on in this presentation. This allows for the system to serve as a means for cells to communicate with each other, regulate a number of metabolic processes, and provide distinct actions at target tissues where specific receptors are present for that hormone. Because the system serves as a means for cells to communicate with each other, all tissues of the body can be considered to be a hormone-producing tissue, not just the classically described quote-unquote endocrine glands. In the response mechanisms, there is a fast response and a slow response. The fast response is neurological in origin. It is acute, it is localized, and is tissue specific. It's involved primarily with the regulation of homeostasis rather than the control of the biochemical pathways. Whereas in the endocrine response, we get a chronic, slow, and generalized response. This generalized response is systemic. It's involved with both the regulation of homeostasis and the control of the biochemical pathways at the tissues. Endocrine slow acting, why are endocrines slow acting? Why are endocrine systemic? The endocrine system is slow acting because of several factors. The first of which is that it utilizes the cardiovascular system to transport its chemical messengers throughout the body. Second, these chemical messengers must bind to carrier proteins in order to be able to move through the blood. Lastly, the chemical messengers need to bind to membrane receptors at the target cells in order to interact with the cell to change the cell function. Why is the endocrine system systemic? It's systemic because almost all tissues have receptors for almost all hormones that are being produced. Second, the interaction at the tissues modulates the physiology of the tissue that leads to universal changes based on enzymes that either get activated or inactivated by interaction with the hormones. The hormones that are produced, identification by chemical structure and method of secretion or distance of action. Chemical classifications. The chemical class will determine how the hormone interacts with the target tissue and includes ways in which it will be transported through the blood and the way in which it will trigger a response at the tissue itself. There are two distinct chemical classes. There is the steroid class, which all come from cholesterol molecules, are hydrophobic, which means they're lipid soluble, and include such hormones as testosterone, estrogen, androgen, cortisol, aldosterone, and thyroid hormones. Because they are lipid soluble, they will need to be bound to a carrier molecule in order to be transported within the water environment of the plasma. But because they are lipid soluble, they can easily diffuse across the plasma membrane at the periphery. You can find a schematic of the steroidogenesis process, the production of steroids, in the downloadable materials. The non-steroid hormones are derived from protein synthesis and either are amines, peptides, proteins, or glycoproteins, and include such hormones as epinephrine, growth hormones, antidiuretic hormone, insulin, just to name a few. All of the hormones in the non-steroid category are hydrophilic and therefore do not necessarily require a binding protein for transportation in the plasma, but most still do. But because they are hydrophilic, they will not be able to diffuse across the membrane at the target tissue and thus require interacting with a membrane protein or receptor in order to initiate the cellular responses. The production of the non-steroid hormone are shown in the downloadable materials as well. The production of the non-steroid hormones give rise to the concepts of prohormones and prehormones within the synthesis pathway. Additionally, the method of discussion of hormones is based on how the hormone is released and where the chemical will have its function. In such, there are 4 distinct methods. The first of which are the endocrine and exocrine secretion methods. These target distant tissues and are involved with systemic responses. Endocrines involve hormones that are directly released into circulation in order to affect a distant target tissue, whereas exocrines are secreted into a duct or into a tube before entering circulation to affect the distant target tissue. It's the endocrine and exocrine secretions which require carriers for the hormones that are being released into circulation. The carrier proteins act to do a few things. The first thing they do is they transport the hormone to the target tissues, which is especially important for the steroid hormones as it allows them to be soluble in the plasma. It extends the half-life of the hormone, and it limits the hormone action at the target tissue by keeping it bound and unable to act to the receptor, or may act as a synergist at the target tissue, allowing for an increased response. Additionally, there is localized effects. These localized effects are paracrine in nature or autocrine in nature. The paracrine involves an effect at an adjacent or nearby tissue or cell, whereas the autocrine effect is based on the secretory cell itself being regulated by the secreting hormone. Things to think about before we move on to the action and regulation. First, what is the purpose of having hormones? What is the difference between the autocrine secretion and the paracrine secretion? What is at least one reason for the endocrine signal to be slow in response within the systems? What is an example of a hormone that would be considered a non-steroid? And what is an example of a hormone that would be considered a steroid hormone?